All right, so back to McCoy's Creek. I was trying to think about, every creek restoration has a story. Why do we need to restore it? How do we get to this point? And where do we go forward from here? And each story is unique. And so I was trying to think, what's unique about McCoy's Creek? And if it was a motion picture, what genre would it be in, right? So how would we tell the story? Is it a mystery? Is it science, dystopian science fiction? And so we're going to contemplate that as we move through the presentation. But this is all about McCoy's Creek and how we might go about restoring it ultimately. So so a little bit of creek background. So McCoy's Creek sits in in roughly a 5 square mile watershed. It has, and in this image, you're facing toward the east, and the St. Johns River is in the background of the image. You've got Interstate 10, Interstate 95, and a creek is flowing under 95 on its way to the river through the neighborhoods of Brooklyn and Hollybrook, Brooklyn, and the riverfront. So there's a huge rail district to the north of the creek, and McCoy's Creek Boulevard runs parallel to the south end of most of the creek, almost to the interstate. So each of the branches drain about 1 square mile watersheds, and it picks up additional contributing land as you move down valley to the tune of about 5.5, almost 6 square miles by the time you reach its inlet from the river. So it is slightly tidally influenced on the lower end, but it's mostly fresh water and more than the upper half of the system, and just very slightly brackish, reflecting some influence from tidal backflow from the river at times. And I used a term called watershed. That's basically the landmass that contributes all the water, all the nutrients and debris, everything that this valley receives from land ultimately is carried by water from rainfall runoff or groundwater flow into McCoy's Creek. And that area, that physical mass of land, is called the watershed. So creeks belong to their watershed. Now, this is an urban creek. As you can see, it is flowing through a combination of industrial development and residential development. And so urban creeks also belong to the communities that surround them, the human communities that surround them. And they're influenced by them, and they influence those communities. And we're going to see how McCoy's Creek has greatly influenced the landscape that surrounds it here, and how it's been changed over time as well. So just thinking through the story of McCoy's Creek is something that got me thinking, well, what would it have started out, right? So to begin with, prior to development, I think if McCoy's Creek was a movie, it would be either a nature documentary or a wilderness adventure, right? So Act 1 of McCoy's Creek is wilderness, a wilderness movie, probably narrated by David Attenborough. And so he'd have been spanning a time, of course, that maybe started roughly 3,000 years ago to the early 1700s in order to make that film on McCoy's Creek. But we can use a lot of scientific relationships between historic or pre-development watershed conditions and river conditions on the downstream end that sort of bracket McCoy's Creek's environment, and we can make some suppositions about what that backdrop in that wilderness movie would have looked like. And in the headwaters, it would have been a small meandering creek that you could easily wade in, children could play in it, and it would have a forested floodplain, a very compact floodplain, but it would be rather densely forested. As you move downstream a little bit more, pick up more flow, the creek gets a little wider, a little deeper, the floodplain gets a little bit bigger, but it would still be freshwater and still forested. Moving further down the valley actually flattens out. the down valley, the slope gets very, very gradual at one point in McCoy's Creek, right about in the middle of the length of the valley, and so flat that the creek just sort of disappears into the swamp, and we call that a strand. So when creeks in Florida enter these very gradual valleys, there's not enough fluvial force to carve and maintain a meandering open channel, so the flow just sort of dissipates. And probably the largest example of that sort of phenomenon occurring in the state, not in a forested fashion, but in a sawgrass fashion, is where the gradient is so low that you can't have a river running through it with a well-defined channel, is the Everglades. Right? So we actually have that in a small scale, and probably was forested where that happened in the middle of the McCoys Creek Valley prior to the disturbance. And then as you continue further downstream, you enter the tidally, it's a microtidal influence, but you enter the more river influenced, and it's sort of the McCoys Creek discharges into the upper estuarine part of the St. Johns River. So there's a little tidal influence, there's a little bit of salt coursing in and out, and the lower part of McCoys Creek almost undoubtedly would have been this kind of a marsh, little salt marsh with a tidal creek running through it. So you can see that the system had a great amount of diversity moving downstream. And now we had to kind of piece that together forensically. So we could have made maybe this first Act 1 movie a mystery, right? Because we had to figure out, well, what's really going on with this creek. And one of the big mysteries to me came from this map. It could have also been a treasure hunt. Because we have maps, right? And so this is an 1864 map of the lower St. Johns River and some of the tributaries. So and these maps are just uncannily accurate. They were done to a very high standard, and they're terrific resources. But they only took them so far because they were mostly interested in the riverbank, and then just, where could you take small warships or war parties up side tributaries. You can see this was happening in Civil War era, and there was battlements around the city. This was downtown Jacksonville right here. So this is McCoys Creek, and you can see here's the Acosta Bridge. I got it faded out so you can see the overlying map. Here's I-95 wrapping around like that. So a little more context. This is Stockton Street, if you happen to know the neighborhoods. And then existing McCoys Creek actually runs south of this alignment. We're going to talk about that a bit more, I think, on the next slide or two, but won't belabor that at this moment. But what you can see is this particular diagonal hatching means marsh from this era of mapping. And the way they did the line work on the creek, that means a nice, broad, open water body. And you can see it kind of meandered up into here. And then they just stopped mapping it here. So the big mystery to me as a restoration designer is, well, how far did the open water tidally influenced what I call Inlet Creek, because it's sort of like an inlet from the river. What did that Inlet Creek, how far did it go? Because I don't know from this map. Did it stop very close to where they stopped mapping, or did it go another mile or two upstream? And so there's no way to know just from this map. So we had to piece that together from other sources of information. And we're going to revisit this issue. I just want to raise it right now and be thinking about how you might go about doing that. All right, so here's Act 2 of McCoys Creek. And it's no longer a wilderness adventure or nature documentary. And now we're getting into the industrial development phase of the creek that started in the early 1900s, maybe a little bit prior, and has really continued through the present. And this genre is clearly horror flick. If you have any kind of environmental interest or background from that perspective, it is absolutely in that genre, and it's rated R. Okay, I mean, it's not just an easy horror flick, it's a tough one to watch. So, and here's why. They literally buried the creek alive. And so the creek used to run, here's that 1864 map, right? So I just did a little cyan trace of the original creek alignment there. You can see the hatching of where the marsh used to be. And what I have sort of underlying that map and also faded out is the 1960 aerial. Okay, so I like the 1960 aerial because it was a nice black and white. So, but you see the whole rail district here was just built in former wetlands and former creek. And the same can be said about you know, all the development that is up here. So I'm not picking on any particular business, but just as a point of reference, the Cash Building Supply Company, who, you know, I met the owner, he's a great guy, I love those guys, but you know, his whole complex is built in what used to be marsh. And he didn't do it, but this was done in the 1920s and 30s, most likely. And so all this wetland was filled, and then the creek was rebuilt south of its original alignment. And it was built by an engineer, or designed by an engineer working for the city called Joseph E. Craig. And Mr. Craig had a vision for basically having a shipping channel that would facilitate and service all of the industrial development that really had previously started along the banks of the creek. And they were trying to tame the creek. The creek was labeled as wild and flood prone and insect ridden. And, you know, it was just, it was looked at as a scourge by people wanting to develop this valley. And so, so they tried to modify it in ways that would be more conducive to a variety of industries. So also, one thing that happened, and this started right around the 1940s and ran through the 60s, the city built a municipal waste incinerator not far from the banks of the creek, and took the ash from that incinerator and just buried it all along the creek alignment in various places. So we have some clean fill that was used to fill wetlands, some hazardous waste that was used to fill the wetlands, so, you know, when they buried the creek alive, they really did a bang up job. And this was probably, you know, the shipping channel, I guess, is what I wanted to talk about here. So this is a sketch made, we believe was made by Joseph Craig, and sometime in the 1920s, and led to this design. And I'm going to revisit the shipping channel. It was made wide. It was made to actually to look nice in an industrial setting, and so they, you know, it was an ambitious project at the time, and really was facilitating primary purposes of what they were trying to accomplish in the valley. But you can see here from this 1948 image where the rail switching and storage lanes are all laid out today, and were back then. They're built in what was a former tidally influenced marsh, and the creek used to run right through that, and then through, you know, where you're starting to get into downtown a little bit, and then into the river way north of its current position. Its current position is along this alignment, right where Mr. Craig designed it, and then it actually goes underground through what is the Times Union property today before it reaches the river. And so this is a great quote from Ennis Davis, who wrote an article for MetroJacksonville.com in 2012 called Lost Jacksonville, McCoy's Creek. And, you know, just some quotes from this is: major pollution during this period. Major pollution occurred from industries lining the creek, all kinds of industries. Now, you know, neighborhood children used to swim in the untamed creek, and they could no longer do this after these industries were there, because at least not safely. I mean, there was times when animal blood was running off. It sounds like a horror flick, doesn't it? Animal blood running off into the creek from a chicken processing plant, you know, the solid waste incinerator ash I talked about. This led to McCoy's Creek being one of the dirtiest water bodies in Duval County. And, you know, and then this happened, right? This guy came out. So, all right. The creek also participated in the burying, right? So the people buried it, and then Mr. Joseph Craig decided, you know, to build this waterway, and it sort of fell out of favor. right? You know, and it's not surprising because there was, you know, a major rail district associated with the creek alignment. And so, you know, they really didn't need a waterway for shipping purposes. So that was kind of by the 40s, they really kind of abandoned it as an industrial service water body. And it really just became like a cesspit of a receiving water body for industrial waste. And in some ways, but it also started filling in on its own. So this particular part of McCoys Creek, and this is McCoys Creek Boulevard running along here, and it was built in a former wetland that fill had been placed into, including ash in places. And this is kind of a lagoon where the water body was deepened and widened. And this happens to be that part of the valley where I mentioned was too flat to support a meandering open channel. Didn't have enough energy. It's too flat from here to here. There's hardly any drop in elevation. And so what happened is it started filling in with sediment. And so this is by 1962. You can see a delta is just kind of built here in the upper end. It had actually started forming prior to the 40s a little bit. So absent maintenance, absent somebody going in and dredging this channel, it would just gradually fill in with sediment over time, and it will become the kind of strand, the flowing forested wetland. We would predict that that's what would happen, what we know today. Now, this science wasn't available to Mr. Joseph Craig in the 1920s. It really wasn't available to the 1950s. So he couldn't have known, but sure enough, it has filled in. So this is what it looked like in 62, and just keep your eye on the ball. This is what it looked like in 71. So we're progressing, you know, just filling itself in over time. By 84, it's more than 2/3 of the way full, you know, and by the 2000s, it's completely filled up. And not only is it filled up with sediment, it's actually growing a forest, right? And so that forest is currently pretty well developed in places on this gradual infill. So what has happened is it has become a strand. And that's what, if we, as a restoration designer, what I would have done was prescribe this as a strand, because based on its valley slope and watershed size and landscape setting. So it sort of over the course of several decades became that on its own. Pretty cool. But from the perspective of somebody who wanted this as a shipping channel, the creek buried itself. All right. Now, the other big driver of, and what really is driving the city's interest in improving McCoys Creek more than anything else is flooding, right? So there's a lot of lands adjacent to the creek that flood even during relatively small rainfall events. The McCoys Creek Boulevard floods, you just get a little inch of rain, 3/4 of an inch of rain, and it floods pretty spectacularly. This is, you know, I was waiting for the bus here one day at this bus stop, and the bus never showed up for some reason. It was very late. But this is because this is McCoys Creek Boulevard running right through here, and this is the intersection with Nixon Street. And so that bus ain't showing up for a while. The McCoys Creek itself is just, you know, just right here along this tree line. So anyway, I was waiting for the bus. It didn't show up, so I swam across the road and the creek, and then I came over to this playground to play, and no one was there because, well, it's flooded. And there's large neighborhoods, large sections of Brooklyn neighborhoods flood, and you know, so this is just a flood-prone area. So the city's main interests here were to alleviate flooding, and they've been thinking about this for probably since the 1980s, and they've budgeted a huge sum of money to address this. That includes restoring the water body as well as raising bridges and so forth. Now, the city's original concept for how to do this was just to dig a bigger ditch, and line it with imported rock, riprap. And this is the classic civil engineering approach to drainage improvement. So, and I think it would have worked really well for that single purpose. But Groundwork Jacksonville had a different idea, and so they're entering this system along with the city and others, into what I would call probably more like the epic romantic drama genre, right? So this is Act 3, and it really started about a couple of years ago when GWJax hired our team, which includes our landscape architectural partners, Scape, which is a New York, New Orleans-based, just incredible landscape architecture design firm that specializes in urban water bodies, and then we have CDM Smith, who's a long-standing city hydrology and hydraulics modeling company, performing that role on our team as well. So, but Groundwork Jacksonville basically hired us to be a matchmaker to try to figure out if there's some way we can get more benefit out of that investment, and possibly in the form of a sexy multi-purpose creek restoration, and match that to the goals of city officials and the local community. And so that's why, I kind of think this is more like a romantic drama, and it's epic, right? Because it's bold and we're thinking about big, ambitious goals. So, so we started with the community, and so Groundwork Jacksonville organized some meetings with local residents that live near the creek. We wanted to find out what their concerns were, what they like about the creek, what they don't like about the creek, and what they'd like to see it become if it could be changed. So they talked about flooding, they talked about public safety and public health, pollution. They wanted clean water. They wanted more green space. They wanted better play space for their families. They wanted wildflowers, trees, birds, fishing. They really did want to embrace the creek. And it's not an embraceable creek. It's a stinky, it hasn't showered. It's just not, you don't want to hug it. It's a creek that you wanted to, it was like pandemic creek. You want to socially distance from it. So they were concerned about McCoys Creek Boulevard closing too. And the city had longstanding plans to close McCoys Creek Boulevard. And I will tell you up front that our plan doesn't change that. We looked to see if we could. It just wasn't in the cards. It's so low lying that even though you'll see we make huge flood reduction benefits with this project, but keeping McCoys Creek Boulevard fully open was not an option. We can actually keep part of it open and still have it meet some safety standards. So, so when people, here's a little pet peeve. I'm just going to get up on this pedestal and we're going to talk about this. I'm the movie director. I get to talk about some things that I don't want my actors doing. And one of the things that I don't want them doing is calling this junk stream restoration. It is not stream restoration. This is the bigger ditch philosophy. So you just build a bigger ditch. You're lining it with rock. And why is it lined with rock? It's lined with all this important rock because it defies nature. You're trying to resist nature. You're trying to gain resiliency by withstanding nature, not by harnessing or working with nature. If you want to call something restoration, stream restoration, it has to tap nature, not defy nature. So this defies nature. And so is this one. This one's a little greener, but it's just a straight, bigger ditch. And there's benefits to those. Those could be designed in ways that they do have some recreational value and some aesthetic value and so forth, but it's not really restoration if it's defying nature. To me, it has to be harnessing nature, natural forces and processes to be deemed restoration. I would call this anything that's this rock lined, and whether it's concrete or big rocks or whatever, to me is just it's just a horizontal fountain. It's not creek restoration. All right, so what do we mean by creek restoration then? It's self-organizing, right? So the classic sort of trapezoidal ditch cross section is very simple. Water flies up and down vertically over time, and it doesn't have anything to spread out into. So that's why you have to armor the sides, because they're going to want to erode, and it really is going to want, because that kind of cross section wants to take on this more complex shape. It wants to build a floodplain. And so it's going to do that by erosion unless you armor it. So this is not a very resilient system, and it's a high maintenance system actually. And So the philosophy in creek restoration is to kind of reserve some part of the valley for nature, and allow the creek to meander through what we call a meander belt. It's literally a zone for the creek over time to move around in, like natural creeks do. And so you're going to keep any kind of important infrastructure out of that zone. And what it does is, by enlarging the floodplain through excavation on the sides of this ditch, you actually make the areas outside of the right-of-way, that infrastructure becomes flood flood-prone too. So we're reducing the flooding, but we're also creating a lot of great variety of different kinds of habitat for fish and for vegetation and birds and so forth. So there's sort of a biodiversity lift by doing this as well, a major biodiversity lift. So in the case of McCoys Creek, what we're doing is, I'm a little bit behind on my time here. Okay, so McCoys Creek, what we're doing is taking sort of some bulkheaded creek, or and with almost no functional floodplain, no meander belt, and we're widening that by excavating. So we're actually going to excavate a floodplain down into lower ground, so there's places for water runoff to go. It currently doesn't have to, and so it currently stacks up and floods a whole bunch of land adjacent to the creek during a sizable rainfall, and now it has a place to go. We've created space or volume for it, and also the drainage capacity is increased as well. So we get the water off more quickly. All right, so just like there were these different zones, like a headwater zone with a little creek, a little headwater creek you could wade, and then the creek gets bigger as you go downstream. We have that same gradient in the existing valley that we have to work with. And this is that flat area I was talking about, that, notice the creek sort of disappears into it, and then it reemerges once it gets into a steeper part of the valley, headed toward the river. And it's a totally different creek type down in this area here. It's that inlet creek, a little more tidally influenced. And up here, it's just a tightly meandering, little tiny headwater, freshwater creek. So you have two big gradients that we're dealing with. One is that gradient of valley slope, how steep that is as you move down the valley. And the other is a salinity gradient. So, how much, both combined tidal and salinity gradient. So, how much influence are we getting from the microtides in the river? And there's another big question. That's part of this romantic drama, is there's a mystery embedded in it. And that mystery is, how fast is sea level going to rise, and what are the ramifications of that to our creek types and the vegetation that we're going to put along them. So we're going to get to that a little bit more, but that's a really important component of this romance. We have to get to know this system and where it's headed in its life, for us to get past the dating stage. And all right, so remember this map I showed earlier? Okay, we're going to go back to this. Remember, I don't know how far up that tidal inlet went historically, and that would be really good information to know. So I got with the St. Johns Riverkeeper, and they generously offered the use of their boat and a boat captain and a couple of their staff members to join our team and take us on a grand boat tour of this many, every dot, however many that is, 10, 12, little creek inlets up and down the lower St. Johns River. And we found ones that were reasonably intact, and we were able to take all kinds of measurements on them, and just in one long day, get a tremendous amount of very valuable data. And one piece of that data is this, L, the length of the tidal inlet as a function of the drainage area of the watershed in square miles. And it turns out there was a really nice linearized relationship we could derive from that. And so I know how long this would have been on average among, on average creek. The other thing is, remember that part of the valley was filling in on its own. It filled into a certain point. It actually filled into about right here. And then it was open. There was an open channel that sort of was retained. And that's all on the cache building supply company's frontage right in here. So, and guess where this regression predicts how long this inlet would have been historically? Right about there. So we have a couple different pieces of information that coincide and say, that's where I should end the tidal inlet part of McCoys Creek. Oh, all right. So we're happy about that. I've got that one checked off. Now, the other thing that's happening, though, is with sea level rise and increased salinity moving upriver, is that the zones within these little inlet creeks, the vegetation along those creeks is shifting, and will continue to shift over time if trends continue or accelerate with sea level rise. So we have to kind of think, we have to hedge our bets on what to plant, and so we did a lot of literature review. There's some really good studies that actually were done on the Ortega River. There's some studies that were done on other coastal plain rivers up through the Carolinas and other places in Florida, and our own observations of the sort of unique, variably influenced creek inlets along the lower St. Johns River. Some are intact, some are not, but we can see impacts. So this is on Goodsby Branch or Goolsby Branch, and there used to be a forest here, and it's dying and being replaced by a marsh that has greater salt tolerance. So we have to take that phenomenon into account. And so what we're doing is sort of like a place for time replacement concept. So as you move further downstream from McCoys Creek, you're getting into higher salinity areas of the river. And so we would expect that that's going to migrate upstream over time. So we can sort of look at, what's going on downstream today and suppose that is akin to what we're going to see in McCoys Creek over the next, progressively increase over the next 30 to 50 years. So this is Long Branch, and Long Branch has its own horror flick industrial impact phase. A lot of its wetland was filled in right here. Kind of what saved it and kept its horror flick PG instead of rated R is this big cemetery, the Evergreen Cemetery, all along its north shore. Kind of kept it, I think, from maybe being very aggressively filled in like some of like many other the tidal influenced creeks all up and down the lower St. Johns River. So this one though shows that gradient we were talking about. So you can see there's this gray area surrounding the creek is emergent marsh, is the tidal marsh, and then there's an abrupt transition into a forest cover over the creek. Right? See that? So that's kind of what we're mimicking, that pattern in McCoys. Right? So we have multiple lines of evidence that pattern is the right thing to do. So we just need to be smart about, and we are smart, I think, about the species that we're picking. So there was a really good study done by UNF and UF on, I think it was the Ortega River, where they looked at changes over time and were able to identify some resilient species that basically can tolerate increased salinity over time better than others. So we were able to select a palette of species to apply to that would grow well under the existing condition and would also thrive under projected conditions in the future. So there's a sort of resiliency built in our planting scheme all up and down the system and following that gradient, not only as it exists today, but as we anticipate it existing in the future. Now, the other thing that we're tying all this into is recreation. So this is really important stuff. Most creek restorations we do, if they're done in rural areas, we're really not thinking a lot about recreation or the community or the social sciences. We're thinking just about nature. Urban creek renewals, to me, are every bit about people and the communities that surround them as they are about nature. So it's a big part of the reason that we have world-class landscape architects on this team. And so what Scape was able to do was kind of come up with some concepts about how we could work with the natural system that we're proposing to build, and then have pocket parks and, of course, the whole trail complex that ties into the big ambitious trail system the city's building as well. So we have these open vistas. We have certain kinds of park environments where we're not as densely forested. People can. It's very approachable to a wider range of viewpoints, and So you have some more wilderness-like areas where, you know, your people who want to explore and get immersed more in nature can do that. But then you have, you know, less intensive activities can be done, and more urban activities as well in other parts of the domain of the restoration. And so that's what one of those areas with this perspective, you know, is projected to look like. So you can see there's, you know, nice open vistas. People can kind of see across from one park to the next across pedestrian bridges, and it's a very useful space for people as well as the nature. So, and then there's, you know, some gardening, but using native plants. So we can put in some native wildflowers and just, you know, kind of meet restoration goals as well as human needs, and for recreation and enjoyment. Frequently get asked, you know, what does this look like over time? And so for the natural parts, you know, the landscape parts will, you know, there'll be larger trees put in, there'll be, you know, it'll be much more manicured and managed. But then the intervening parts and the bulk of the project area is more of a rewilding. And so, and that's gonna, you know, go through succession and mature over time. And we're planting mostly small stock, mostly nursery grown plants. So this is a ditch that was dug in the 40s. It's about 10 feet deep. It divorced the original creek that meandered through here from its floodplain and bypassed it. And in this particular example, and then this project was completed in February of this year, and that's what it looks like. So we filled in the ditch after we built this new channel, and it just functions a lot better. But when it's brand new, it's a fluvial geomorphologist's dream, because you can see all the morphology, right? It's relatively barren, you know, and all the plants are really tiny. But it's Florida, right? So it grows, everything grows nice and fast. And by year 1 or 2, this is just lush and green. And by year 3, it's pretty dense and shrubby. And so this is a little floodplain I did for a very tiny ephemeral creek. The creek's right here during the dry season. But you can I just took this picture, not because we're actually building anything exactly like this in McCoy's Creek, but just to show you how dense the vegetation gets. So this is year 3 vegetation. You can see some of the trees, you know, they're starting to poke up through the herbaceous vegetation at this point in time. By year 7, they'll be kind of, you know, year 7, maybe if they're slow growing to year 10, but I'm thinking year 7 for this setting. We'll have a nice kind of overhead young canopy of trees, and by year 20, year 15, year 20, it looks like this. This is my oldest stream restoration in Florida. It's time this photograph was taken was 20 years old. This project now is close to 30 years old. It has, you know, it has trees on it people would guess would be much older than they are, right? So a lot of people look at this cypress tree and say that's 100 years old. No, it's 20. And this creek's very wadeable. I mean, it's got good fish in it. It actually was taking polluted water from upstream, and it knocked about 80% of the pollutants out and turned, you know, met class 3 water quality standards, which is for nature, and swimming and fishing. So yeah, just this stuff works fantastic. It develops, you know, over the course of any young person's life. And you know, I won't give away my age when I was involved with this project, but you know, I was able to enjoy it as a very naturally functioning system as it unfolded during every phase of its development. It's providing some natural function and benefit. This is a 15-year-old forest. That was the bird I had on my shoulder. And a multi-species heronry formed on this, I think, right around year 12. And this was a strand. So, you know, as part of a complex that was very similar to what we're proposing in the freshwater parts of McCoys. And so this is where that valley kind of flattened out in this particular project example. And so, you know, these can be great resources for bird watchers, and of course the birds themselves. And they're also great resources for fishermen, right? So when we start getting down into, we're actually creating some fishing ponds embedded within the strand. And so there'll be some freshwater fishing that we're promoting. but also fishing down toward the river, right? So we're creating great fish habitat, and I've been working pretty closely with some moat marine scientists, Dr. Nate Brennan and Jim Lacascio, that are, they're fisheries experts, and they are very excited for our stream restoration protocols because they, even though we didn't necessarily design them specifically for fish originally, we kind of hoped it would be good fish habitat, but these guys are confirming that those protocols are just be outstanding for just a wide variety of estuarine and freshwater fishes. So the benefits of what we're proposing is we're going to easily meet the city's flood level of service improvement objectives. I mean, in some places we're taking areas that have on average are, a 1% chance of flooding and turning that down to 1/5 of that. We're upstream of Stockton, where areas that routinely flood are much less routinely going to flood. And we're reducing the 100-year flood zone. The FEMA flood zone is being reduced substantially throughout the whole valley. And the largest area reductions are occurring in the Brooklyn neighborhood. So that's helping some of the redevelopment programs and affordable housing developments and so forth that are either proposed or already under construction in that area do so outside of a FEMA flood zone that currently is FEMA flood zone. So, so this is having future benefits for flood risks. Creek restoration, unlike the bigger ditch approach, is self-organizing and intrinsically resilient against climate change, against storm intensification, against erosion, et cetera. It provides pollutant removal. The bigger ditch wouldn't provide the pollutant removal. We're actually physically removing ash contamination, but the creek and the wetlands that we put in cleanse the water as it progresses downstream. The fish habitat I mentioned, biodiversity I've mentioned, recreation I talked about. I touched on the fact that we're paying attention to that. So there'll be kayakable portions of this system. There'll be boardwalks, perhaps places people can wade, fish, et cetera. So really terrific diversity of experiences that you can derive from the creek itself, but also from the trail alongside of it. So there'll be opportunity for exercise, for bird watching, for relaxing along the creek. There's lots of economic studies that show that these kinds of projects they serve as an economic stimulus and increase property value. And we're basically turning what is viewed as a nuisance, kind of somebody, like I said, you wouldn't date, to something you can embrace. And that's the end game for this epic romantic drama. Now, the producers, directors, I think Groundwork Jacksonville has played I would say, is the prime driver in the form that this is taking, right? So that the fact that we have stream restoration instead of just a bigger ditch, I think is absolutely to Groundwork Jacksonville's credit. Also is to the credit to the city of Jacksonville that they're willing to take on an ambitious, it's certainly not without precedent, but I think for Florida, this is a leading project. It's going to set precedent for other communities in the state. It is a bang up thing. And so this is all the producers and directors of our movie. So we've got, Groundwork Jacksonville, we have community leaders, we have the city of Jacksonville, and we have the design team. And and we have actors too. So this actor right here is Daniel Craig, right? You guys probably recognize. Oh wait, I'm sorry, I had my glasses off. That's me. I don't look anything like Daniel Craig. I wish I did. But anyway, this is our producer director team, and we're all excited about this project. And of course, big actor in all this is the environment we're working with. That's why I threw that slide in there. So with that, I'm 15 minutes over time. I apologize, but I hope you learned some things about creek restoration, about McCoy's Creek, where we're headed with it and why. And I'm available for questions.